So some tales from the basement. So I actually wanted to talk about guitar, not cello, but I got banned to the basement, and I'm working on my scale. So I wanted to talk about music theory again. So I've been fascinated. I've always been fascinated by musicians, specifically guitarists. Even though I'm not playing guitar in this video, that supposedly and musicians in general, because I'm going to talk about the Beatles, and they obviously played various instruments, that did not know how to they didn't know music theory. And we're going to talk about what theory is and what did they know music theory or didn't they know music theory. So a couple of people come to mind. People talk about the Beatles are one. That one I find really, really hard to believe, but supposedly they didn't know music theory. Jimi Hendrix is one. There's just a whole slew of musicians that supposedly did not know how to read music, and they figured things out through themselves, just on their own volition. So I guess the first thing, my starting point is I wouldn't say I'm in disbelief, because I kind of look at my path and how I learned music, and I always said I learned it organically, and which was basically listening to songs. I grew up listening to contemporary music, and based upon my age, I grew up listening to a lot of Prince, everything from Led Zeppelin and classic rock, Cream, Clapton, obviously Hendrix, and then the jazz stuff, Wes Montgomery, Pat Martino, and I learned to tune a guitar by ear. At the time I was learning to play guitar, there were no guitar tuner, or I couldn't go to YouTube and then just figure out how to do things. My learning grounds was basically working off of a cassette. So I would actually, just record stuff. I remember learning Stair to Heaven that way. Just keep recording it back, going back and back and back like that. And so over time, my ears developed. And I played in a lot of different bands growing up, playing everything from Rick Springfield and just your classic rock kind of thing, Journey, all of that stuff. Oh my God. So anyway, let's get back to what I want to talk about, which was music theory. As a musician, do you actually need to know music theory to be functional? That depends, and let's talk about what we mean by music theory. I guess I think about music theory three ways. One is historical. Basically, depending upon your instruments that you play, when people talk about music theory, they talk about it in one way. One way is the historical analysis of it. It's like if you take a music history class, they'll teach you the evolution of the violin, the cello, just music composers, Bach, Beethoven. If you're taking a class like in jazz, you'll learn about bebop. You'll learn about, fusion and things of that nature. So that's one way. The second way that people talk about music theory is the way that I think most musicians know about it. That is the ability to read and write music. Okay. And that's really what music theory is focused on. The third way is terminology. What do we say when we are talking about I am in the key of G? I am in the key of C. What are the chord structure? And so music theory to me is a combination of the second and third, which is the ability to read and write it, and the third definition, which is the terminology that you use. So music theory to me is basically a form of communication. And I would argue that all of the musicians that people say, from Wes Montgomery to Jimi Hendrix to the Beatles, that they did not know music theory, they did know music theory. So theory is an explanation of what you're doing. So theory does not dictate the music. The music dictates the theory. Okay, let me say that again. Theory itself does not dictate the music. It's the music that dictates the theory. So it's basically an explanation of how you are doing something. And mystically, everybody from Hendrix to the Beatles to the Stone, Eric Clapton even. I mean, I was watching some stuff. He said he was embarrassed. He had a gig with Aretha Franklin, and he was afraid, if you put charge of stuff in front of him, he couldn't figure out what they were doing. But the thing about this, if you look at music as a form of communication, all of these great bands, especially the Beatles, let me talk a little bit more about these guys. Um, they knew how to communicate with each other. So when we talk about communication, when you talk about theory, it's like, okay, what key am I in? When I started playing this cello, and I kind of used it as a background because I'm not a cellist. I'm just kind of learning with it and I dabble with it. I was in the key of G. I knew that. I played a bunch of different octaves of the G major scale. And I know that, oh my God, this is G major scale. It's got an F sharp in it. I know the way it should sound. I know songs that kind of fall into it. And then I played on top of Old Smoky, and I can figure things out by ear. So I can explain to somebody what I'm doing in that in on top of Old Smoky and in the key of G major. So if you posit the fact that theory is just a modes of explaining something, and it's a modes of communication, it's not as relevant today as it used to be. So if Bach wrote something back then, he had to write it down so another pianist or organist could play this stuff. Right now, because of social media and because of all this stuff, you guys are watching me on YouTube, you can watch somebody and it's recorded. Written music was it's a great invention because people could look at something and play it, but you had to understand the language. So if you think about it from that perspective, the Beatles were able to communicate amongst themselves. I would argue that they still knew a lot of music theory, or I think it was George Martin, the guy who put a lot of stuff down. He was really the fifth Beatle in a sense, because he put a lot of the stuff that they were playing. I mean, I was watching something where a chord like a F add 9, right? And I think George Harrison was explaining what he was playing in the song. And an add 9, not to go bar theory, a ninth is the same as a second. So in the key of F, the second note is F, G is G, right? So a G is the ninth because it's the same as the ninth note. So what he called it was, oh, I'm playing an F and I just put a G on the bottom. So he didn't understand it, maybe theoretically, saying an add 9 or in the traditional technical way, but he had a means of explaining it. So in other words, they didn't know music in the theoretical sense that they went to conservatory. They can tell you this is a semitone, this is the scale, this is the Lydian mode, this is all this stuff. But they knew it enough to be able to communicate with the people that they were playing. There are tons of supposedly jazz musicians who did not, I think Chet Baker, Ornette Coleman, and the list goes on, that supposedly did not know how to read music. When they say they didn't know how to read music, you couldn't put this in front of them and have them sight read it perfectly, or they couldn't explain it to you in the traditional musical sense. But they had ways and mechanism of communicating what they were doing on the bandstand, and specifically jazz. I don't even want to touch classical music or even pop music like that. The way jazz was taught historically was on the bandstand. So if you were at a jam session, somebody would show you something and there would be a mechanism for them to tell you what they were playing, and they would be visually showing you. So in a way, it was very similar to the whole YouTube stuff. Like if I was hitting the G13th and you didn't know it, I could show you what my hands were doing. In fact, there's a story with Paul McCartney and George Harrison. They didn't know what a B7th was. They didn't know the chord. So they knew a guy that knew a B7, so they got on some bus and they went and found him, and the guy showed them what a B7 was. Then it was like, okay, great, and then they incorporated it. So they might not have known all of the notes that made up the chord, but if you look at the definition of theory as a way to explain what you're doing, they had that in them. And they did not have the formal training. And, quite frankly, there are some people, whether people want to agree with it or not, that do have a certain level of innate ability. And I want to get to the point where, like, we're not Paul McCartney, we're not Jimi Hendrix, we're not Ornette Coleman, we're not Wes Montgomery, we're not any of those people. God bless you if you are one of them. And so people who need to communicate in other ways that do not have that natural innate ability where it just comes out have to learn music theory, or they should learn music theory, because it's just a means of communication. So to me, music theory is important. The one thing I wanted to talk about when I go on this rant about music theory, when people talk about, I think a lot of people think it's cool to say they don't know music theory. For whatever reason, I get this, it's like this impression that it's cooler to say you do not know music theory and you're just playing something because you got some God given talent. It's very, very cool. I'm not saying I'm gonna peel back the onion and feel like, hey man, you went to Juilliard or you went to Curtis and you're just like fronting. But it's just like when musicians were on a heroin kick, they thought they had to be drug addicts in order to, get their creativity out. So to me, it's not cool. Let's just put it that way. I don't know music theory to the level that I wish I knew, but I do make it a point to try to understand what I'm playing and to try to explain it to other people that are interested in knowing about it. Knowledge is fundamental, it's key, it's a way of communication, and ignorance is not bliss. If I'm playing a G13th, if I'm playing an F sharp 9th or minor 7 flat at 5th, I want to show it to you. I want to tell you what I am, how I'm playing it. So to me, ignorance is not bliss. It is good to kind of know what you're doing and have a mechanism for explaining it to somebody. And to me, music is like the English language. As I'm speaking, I don't really have to think about a lot of the things that I'm saying because I learned the alphabet, I learned phonetics, and so I can process that. And music is just another way, it's just another language, and music theory is the same way. So anyway, sorry for the long video. I've just been watching a lot of music theory and just kind of want to get at that. I do think it's important to learn music theory, or at least develop a mechanism for explaining what you're doing and to be able to go back to that stuff. And it's also good because it's a great way to learn other people's music and just educate yourself, period. So it does not do away with your creativity. That is a fallacy. Anybody who tells you that if you're reading off a chart or if you learn music theory, you get boxed in. No. Classical musicians are some of the most creative people, and I would say 99.9% of classical musicians do know music theory. All right, then. Sorry for the long video, and thank you again for watching. Hopefully you got something out of this. Take care. Bye now.